The Gnome, a tale of Brothers Grimm. There was once upon a time a rich king who had 3 daughters who daily went to walk in the palace garden. The king was a great lover of all kinds of fine trees, but there was one for which he had such an affection that if any one plucked an apple from it, he wished him 100 fathoms underground. When harvest time came, the apples on this tree were all as red as blood. The 3 daughters went every day beneath the tree, and looked to see if the wind had not blown down an apple, but they never by any chance found one, and the tree was so loaded with them it was almost breaking, and the branches hung down to the ground. Then the king's youngest child had a great desire for an apple, and said to her sisters, "Our father loves us far too much to wish us underground. It is my belief he would only do that to people who were strangers." And while she was speaking, the child plucked an apple from the tree, and ran to her sisters, saying, "Taste, my dear sisters, for never in my life have I tasted anything so delightful." Then the other 2 sisters also ate some of the apple, whereupon all 3 sank deep down to the earth, where they could hear no cock crow. When midday came, the king wished to call them to come to dinner, but they were nowhere to be found. He sought them everywhere in the palace and garden, but could not find them. Then he was much troubled, and made known to the whole land whosoever brought back his daughters should have one of them to wife. Hereupon so many young men went about the country in search, there was no counting them, for every one loved the 3 children because they were kind to all and fair of face. 3 young huntsmen also went out, and when they had travelled for 8 days they arrived at a great castle, in which were beautiful apartments, and in one room a table was laid, on which were delicate dishes that were still so warm they were smoking. But in the whole of the castle no human being was either to be seen or heard. They waited there for half a day, and the food still remained warm and smoking, and at length they were so hungry they sat down and ate, and agreed with one another they would stay and live in that castle, and one of them, whom should be chosen by casting lots, would remain in the house, the others would seek the king's daughters. They cast lots, and the lot fell on the eldest, so next day the 2 younger went out to seek, and the eldest had to stay home. At midday came a small mannikin, and begged for a piece of bread. Then the huntsman took the bread which he had found there, and cut a round off the loaf, and was about to give it to him. But whilst he was giving it to the mannikin, the latter let it fall, and asked the huntsman to be so good as to give it to him again. The huntsman was about to do so, and stooped, on which the mannikin took a stick, seized him by the hair, and gave him a good beating. Next day the second stayed at home, and he fared no better. When the 2 others returned in the evening, the eldest said, "How have you got on?" "Badly," said he, and they lamented their misfortune together, but said nothing about it to the youngest, for they did not like him at all, and always called him Stupid Hans, because he did not exactly belong to the forest. On the 3rd day the youngest stayed at home, and again the little mannikin came and begged for a piece of bread. When the youth gave it to him, the elf let it fall as before, and asked him to be so good as to give him that piece again. And said Hans, "Can you not pick it up for yourself? If you will not take as much trouble as that for your own bread, you do not deserve to have it." Then the mannikin grew angry and said he was to do it, but the huntsman would not, and took the dear mannikin and gave him a thorough beating. And the mannikin screamed terribly and said, "Stop, stop, let me go, I will tell you where the king's daughters are." When Hans heard that, he left off beating him, and the mannikin told him he was an earth mannikin, and there were more than 1,000 like him, and if he would go with him, he would show him where the king's daughters were. And he showed him a deep well with no water in it, and the elf said he knew well the companions Hans had with him did not intend to deal honourably with him, therefore if he wished to deliver the king's children, he must do it by his own self. The 2 other brothers would also be very glad to recover the king's daughters, but they did not want to have trouble or danger. Hans was therefore to take a large basket, seat himself in it with his hanger and a bell, and be let down. Below were 3 rooms. In each of them was a princess with a many-headed dragon, whose heads she was to comb and trim, but he must cut them off. Having said this, the elf vanished. When it was evening, the 2 brothers came and asked how he had got on. He said, "Oh, pretty well so far," and he had seen no one at midday, when a little mannikin had come and begged for a piece of bread. He had given some to him, and the mannikin had let it fall, and asked it to pick him up again, but as he did not choose to do that, the elf had begun to lose his temper, and he had done what he ought not, and given the elf a beating, on which he had told him where the king's daughters were. Then the 2 were so angry at this, they grew green and yellow. Next morning they went to the well together, and drew lots who should seat himself first in the basket. Again the lot fell on the eldest, and he was to seat himself in it, and to take the bell with him. And he said, "If I ring, you must draw me up again immediately." When he had gone down for a short distance, he rang, and they drew him up again. Then the second seated himself in the basket, but he did the same as the first, and then it was the turn of the youngest, who let himself to be lowered quite to the bottom. When he'd got out of the basket, he took his hanger and went and stood outside the first door and listened, and the dragon was snoring quite loudly. He opened the door slowly, and one of the princesses was sitting there and had 9 dragons' heads in her lap, and was combing them. Then he took his hanger and hewed at them, and the 9 fell off. The princess sprang up, threw her arms round his neck, embraced and kissed him repeatedly, and took her stomacher, which was made of pure gold, and hung it round his neck. Then he went to the second princess, who had a dragon with 5 heads to comb, and delivered her also, and to the youngest, who had a dragon with 4 heads, he went likewise. They all rejoiced, and embraced him and kissed him without stopping. Then he rang very loud so that those above heard him, and he placed the princesses one after another in the basket, and had them all drawn up. But when it came to his own turn, he remembered the words of the elf, who told him his comrades did not mean well by him. So he took a great stone that was lying there, and placed it in the basket. When it was about halfway up, his false brothers cut the rope so that the basket with the stone fell to the ground, and they thought he was dead. And they ran away with the 3 princesses, making them promise to tell their father it was they who had delivered them. And they went to the king, and each demanded a princess in marriage. In the meantime, the youngest huntsman was wandering about the 3 chambers in great trouble, fully expecting to have to end his days there, when he saw hanging on the wall a flute, and he said, "Why do you hang here? No one can be merry here." He looked at the dragon's head likewise, and said, "You cannot help me now." He walked backward and forward for such a long time, he made the surface of the ground quite smooth. But at last other thoughts came to his mind, and he took the flute from the wall and played a few notes on it. Suddenly a number of elves appeared. With every note he sounded, another came. He played until the room was entirely filled. They asked what he desired, and he said he wished to get above ground back to daylight, on which they seized him by every hair that grew on his head, and flew with him onto the earth again. When he was above ground, he at once went to the king's palace, just as the wedding of one princess was about to be celebrated, and went to the room where the king and his 3 daughters were. When the princesses saw them, they fainted. Hereupon the king was angry, and ordered him to be put in prison at once, because he thought he must have done some harm to his poor children. But when the princesses came to themselves, they entreated the king to set him free. The king asked why, and they said they were not allowed to tell him. So their father said, "Tell it to the stove." He went out and listened at the door as they told the stove, and heard everything. And he caused the 2 brothers to be hanged on the gallows, and to the 3rd he gave his youngest daughter. On that occasion I wore a pair of glass shoes, and I struck them against a stone, and they said, "Clink," and were broken. The end.